This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
So briefly, as I was arguing on Wednesday, war breaks out in Massachusetts, not very much to anybody's surprise, in the spring of 1775. And here we have a rare photograph which has somehow survived in the archives of what the British soldiers actually looked like. I suspect they're in a lot better shape than this rather motley crew of reenactors we see up here. Here again is the map of Boston, which reminds you what a difficult strategic situation General Thomas Gage was operating in from the spring of 1774 on. That's to say, Boston's a peninsula, and he can't move anywhere into the countryside without his movements being detected and without the Americans having pretty good intelligence as to where he's going and how he's going to get there. And of course, he's stuck with a few thousand troops in what is in effect the most densely settled region of British North America. And so that if the Americans have to respond to any kind of alarm or any kind of scare, as had been the case back in September 1774 during the so-called powder alarm, literally thousands of armed men can be on the march towards Boston in a matter of hours, because you have all these towns with all their militia units. It's not that all these units are that well trained, and it's not that everybody is all that well armed. It's not that every American is packing an effective firearm, and in fact, the Americans depend a lot during the war upon shipments of arms from France and from Holland. To keep themselves well armed, but anyhow, it's a terrible environment for Gage and his successors to have to operate in, and so it happens. Listen, my children, you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. What happens on the night of April 18th, 1775, is Gage has received new orders from his superiors in London, Lord North and the King being foremost among them, and Lord Germain. And they're really quite upset with his lack of activity, and they give him firm orders to start trying to, not to stay bottled up in Boston, but to try to get out in the countryside and restore royal authority, which basically has been effectively undermined ever since the spring of 1774. Excuse me, the spring of 1774. So Gage heads out to, Gage sends a couple columns heading out towards Concord. Some thousands of men, pretty significant force. The Americans, of course, have word of it. Paul Revere and William Dawes and others start spreading the alarm. There's an early engagement in Lexington where the British see that Lexington's not the objective, Concord is, but the British see some American militiamen are gathering there, so they send a party into the town in a somewhat chaotic scene, which this fairly accurate representation of, we think, by a colonial engraver named Amos Doolittle. Excuse me. It's a kind of ragged exchange. The Americans take some casualties and kind of scatter, and you get a sense of that. We have to leave the lights on for the filming, so it's the taping, so you can't quite see the details well as you like. But the Americans are breaking. The British are still arraying their ranks. No one's quite expected. Probably words are being exchanged or insults being hurled. The Americans were quite good at hurling insults. By this point, they had a lot of practice, and so there's a preliminary skirmish at Lexington, and then of course the columns move on to Concord, which is the real objective. That's where the Massachusetts Provincial Congress has been storing its arms and munitions, and that's where the British think maybe they might be able to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the two guys they see as the ringleaders of colonial resistance. They're still operating under the assumption that if we can crack resistance in Massachusetts, then we can get all the other colonies to fall into line. At least that's the strategy that had been set in motion early in 1774, and nobody other than Edmund Burke back in England, whose brilliant speech on conciliation delivered 3 to 4 weeks before the events we're looking at had transpired. Nobody but Burke and a handful of real visionaries were explaining why that strategy was doomed to fail. So we get the second major exchange at Concord, where the Americans are there in much more force and presence and better lined up. And now it's the British who have to retreat. And they have to retreat all the way to Boston. Anybody who's ever, I used to live more or less in the neighborhood. So they're not going back down Route 2 because Route 2 doesn't exist yet. But they are heading, but they are retreating all the way back to Boston. And of course, the Americans are drawn up, and the Americans are doing a lot of sniping because there's a lot of, cover, some natural and a lot man-made in the form of all those stone walls behind which the Americans can line up and fire away. And the British sustained pretty significant casualties on the retreat. And so this is the outbreak of war. The second engagement, of course, is fought 2 months later. This is Bunker Hill. This is the death of General Joseph Warren, the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the founder actually of a family of New England, a very distinguished family of New England physicians, but also a political leader who was, in fact, not the sole commander of the field. You'll see an echo here, of course, of the famous death of General Wolfe, Benjamin West's famous painting from done during the French and Indian War. Here's another representation showing the town of Charleston, which is where Bunker and Breeds Hill are, just directly north of the north end of Boston, in flames, and the Americans, could all up and down the Charles River could see the smoke from burning Charleston. And then here's a more satirical representation, again playing on women's. I can't decode this one, but again playing on women's hair fashions from the 1770s of Bunker Hill as some elaborate, American women's headdress. I'll leave this one up for a while, just to amuse you. After April 1775, the whole question of independence, I think, was essentially a matter of timing and of tactical considerations. As a matter of principle, in terms of the colonists' basic understanding of what they thought of as the underlying contract of government, the Americans were morally free, politically free, to declare independence at any point from the spring of 1775 on. Why? For the simple reason that in 17th and 18th century Anglo-American thinking about the fundamental nature of government, the obedience that you, or let's say that we as a people, owe to a government, in this case to its manifestation, the sovereign George III, is something we render in exchange for protection. That's the basic contract, at least at the simplest, most rudimentary level. If you ask the question, what is government all about? If you think in contractarian terms, if you try to go back to a Hobbesian or Lockean world in which you're imagining some kind of collective agreement and some kind of authorization of someone to rule under some set of underlying assumptions and values, the basic notion is we offer our allegiance, we offer our obedience in exchange for your protection. Protection might have a literal physical sense, protection against violence and disorder, or it might mean protection through law, through the king's courts, through the avenues of justice and so on. But that's the underlying contract. Civil war is, by definition, at least from an American perspective, civil war seems to be the opposite of protection. Now, it could be the king in his wisdom knows better than you do what's really in your interest. But for reasons that Burke lays out very well in that speech on conciliation that I hope we're discussing in sections yesterday and today, that's not a perception that Americans are going to share. Burke has that wonderful line about the litigiousness of Americans, their legal sensitivities, that they augur misgovernment at a distance and snuff the approach of tyranny in every tainted breeze. I think I got that more or less correct, pretty close. You could look it up. As they say. And that's, there is that aspect of American culture. So the king may know better what's in your interest than you think you do. That's not going to carry much weight for the American colonists. So it really, at any point from the spring of 1775 on, the Americans felt morally free to declare independence, and they would have been within their rights to do so under this kind of conventional thinking. But whether or not it was really in their interest to do so, whether or not that's what they should do, whether or not that was the most attractive or promising course of action, that's what remained to be sorted out. And those of you choosing paper option number 1, right, when you look at how the delegates are thinking about this in the 6 weeks or so before the vote of July 2nd and the approval of the Declaration of July 4th, what I want you to be thinking about is what were the specific considerations that the colonists, or let's say that these leading colonists had in mind as they make the final decision for independence. We're much more concerned with how did they decide independence, how and when they did, than with what's in the language of the Declaration. I mean, that's what we're reading about in Pauline Maier's book, but what you're going to write about with Pauline Maier's book as your background is how they thought about the decision. That's the challenge of paper option number 1, okay? So it's a question. It's not a question of principle anymore. It's a question of timing. It's a question of tactics. It's a question of what are our best options given the kind of political information we have about British intentions and our own resources and prospects for foreign assistance and so on. So that's the basic situation. Let me offer a few, what I call here on the outline, excuse me, some final judgments about how to think about this again as an analytical problem, as a working political historian, trying to think somewhat systematically about it would do so. First off, let's think about this from the British perspective, because my argument all along has been that the British are the actors and the Americans are not the reenactors like those poor schleps we had up there before, but are the reactors. It's British initiative, American response. That's the underlying dynamic of this whole set of political events. British are in an impossible position. They have a genuine dilemma, at least as they perceive it. They find it very difficult, as a matter of political imagination, to conceive how they could possibly abandon that claim of parliamentary supremacy that is at the heart of the constitutional quarrel. The Americans are going to push their positions and say, Parliament has no role in our governance except that to which we cheerfully consent. That's such a heterodox, such a heretical position from the mainstream British perspective, that it takes a lot of really creative thinking to get outside that box, especially if you go on a kind of slippery slope analysis, which policymakers would be naturally inclined to favor, which says, if we give them one concession, where do we stop? If you begin by with any kinds of suspicions about what Americans' ulterior motives or deeper intentions might be, to make one concession, won't that just put you on a slippery slope so that from one year to the next or one decade to the next, your effective ability to control the American colonies, to govern them, is going to erode? So it's very difficult for the British, thinking within that constitutional tradition, to imagine how do we move away from this kind of dominant position that's been the heart of our political orthodoxy since at least 1689. On the other hand, the British have a genuine dilemma, which I think I've pointed out, I think, pretty effectively previously, just to restate it. They don't have political assets that they can mobilize. One of the TAs was saying somebody wants to hear about the Loyalists and so on. I want to say, I'll try to say something more about them next week. There weren't that many. There weren't enough to be effective. During the war, some pockets of active loyalism emerge. And they tend to follow, in some ways, they follow ethnic lines more than ideological lines. 1774, 1775, early 1776, I think Americans are pretty united around what they call the common cause. And it's now just the cause of Massachusetts. It's really a common American cause, in part because the British are going to start carrying the war up and down the coast and bring it home to other provinces. So I think there are loyalists, but they tend to be British. The most active and vocal ones tend to be British officials or sympathizers. They tend to be Anglican divines, Anglican clerics, ministers of the Church of England. It's very hard to find pockets in the sense of political demography. It's very hard to find pockets of loyalism. So we think of kind of a red state, coming off the election. If we think about red states and blue states, we try to think, who are the redcoats and who's going to dress in the buff and blue of the Continental Army. It's going to be a pretty blue landscape. Doesn't mean everybody is equally committed to the cause, but it does mean loyalists find it almost impossible to organize in any systematic way. So the British don't have political assets. Not having political assets, they have no recourse but to rely on force, but they don't have enough troops to recapture the initiative. At least they won't for some time. They will right after independence. But in this whole period down until July 1776, they simply don't have enough boots on the ground to do anything very effectively. So they're losing political control. They have no way to reclaim it, but they can't imagine what kind of concessions or what kinds of accommodations will they make. So that's one factor. To some extent, it is a matter of imagination. On the outline, I put this parenthetical question: if Burke got it, why couldn't Lord North, or why couldn't the King? Or why couldn't Lord Germain, who's the Secretary of State for America? Burke is a dissenter. I mean, Burke shows that it's possible to think outside the box. I think that speech I'm asking you to read, for my money, it's the most sophisticated, and I've read a lot of political commentary, it's the most sophisticated piece of political analysis I think I've ever read in my life about any situation. It's really subtle, it's complex. It's an attempt to study the emerging notion of national character. As mentioned to the TAs, that those of us who know Burke from his reflections on the revolution in France, that he'll published, in 1789, 1790. That Burke is seen as a kind of somebody trying to, in a kind of fumbling way, trying to formulate a concept of national character with somewhat mixed results. It's also, I think, the motif that's embedded in this brilliant speech. He's trying to say, here's what we know about the character of Americans as a people. And it's really a subtle and very powerful and really kind of very comprehensive analysis. But maybe it takes that kind of refined political intelligence. So maybe Lord North and the King lacked that imagination, and they worried about the slippery slope consequences. They just could not get it, and so on. Okay. Now, when we go to the American side, this is something I want the paper writers to be thinking about. The last big set of points I want to make about the coming of independence really pivots on how to think about the slight but not insignificant differences of opinion that would have operated among the colonists themselves, and particularly among their leaders. And I want to distinguish between moderates and militants, or moderates and radicals. And the Adamses and the Lees, and, we've seen their portraits previously, so I won't put them back up. But Samuel and John Adams, Richard Henry Lee, his brother Francis Lightfoot Lee, his paranoid younger brother Arthur Lee, these guys all qualify as radicals. The ones who really do think there is a conspiracy or some kind of systematic plan afoot in Britain to strip us of all our rights and maybe to turn us into slaves in the political sense of the term, the better to enslave our fellow Englishmen. And then you have a group of moderates. And let's say here's the big guy, Washington, after the Battle of Princeton. Here are some representative moderates. Can anybody identify these guys from memory or recognition? On the left, we have the first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay. Very good. And on the right, we have two guys with the same last name, and the somewhat porkier guy on the right, the guy at the potbelly, was the first superintendent of finance from 1781 to 1784. Yeah, both the Morrises, very good. And which one's on the right is Robert, and on the left is Gouverneur Morris on the left. And these are kind of representative moderates. These guys, I have a whole chapter devoted to them in the book I just finished, because I find their situation really interesting. These are guys who get into politics. They basically agree with the American consensus on the issues. But they're not radicals. They're not ideologues. What is all the noise we're getting from? Is it coming from outside or what? You guys okay with this? It's a little distracting. Okay, so these guys, they're not radicals, they're not ideologues. They get sucked into politics, and I think that's really the right expression. They get sucked into politics in 1774, 1775, not as advocates of national liberation, but really because they're desperate to promote the cause of accommodation. They're men of business. Jay is a lawyer. Descended from a Huguenot family. His ancestors have been prosperous merchants. Robert Morris comes over as a kind of young man with his father. They settle first in Cambridge, Maryland. Actually, just there for a wedding in the spring. There's actually an inn right on an inlet off the Chesapeake, which was the original Morris homestead. Except his father sets up a second common law family and sends Robert off to Philadelphia to be a merchant apprentice in the great firm of Willing, Thomas Willing and his father. The father dies. Morris joins the firm. I think he marries into it, if I remember correctly. He's really just a truly ambitious merchant. He's really a man of business, more than anything else. He's not a political activist by any means. So these guys find themselves being sucked up into politics 1774, 1775, not because they're architects of national liberation, but because they're really desperately hoping that the British will come to their senses and they'll promote the cause of accommodation. So the moderates have a real dilemma. And their dilemma is, to be effective politically, they have to sign on to all the military measures that everybody else is taking. That includes the appointment of Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. It takes place right around the time, right after the word of Bunker Hill comes down to Philadelphia, reaches the Continental Congress. Everybody admires Washington, in part, as one Connecticut delegate says. I put this on yesterday's outline. He's no harum-scarum, ranting, swearing fellow, but sober, steady, and calm. Washington had such kind of commanding charisma. And he was pretty much our best trained soldier. So, plus he came from Virginia and There's a kind of intersectional aspect to his appointment. So you have these guys who, to be effective, to make the, in order to still be effective politically, they have to agree with escalation. They have to agree with all the defensive measures the Americans are going to take. They have to agree with all the war preparations, and precisely because they are moderates, precisely because they really understand the... Can you guys hear me? This is really... Maybe close it. I mean, this is... I'm sorry to have to make this interruption, but of course, I'll start sweating like a pig as this happens. Nick, do you want to run? Nick, do you want to run outside and see what's going on? Do you mind doing this? Just tell them Groucho sent you. I mean, maybe I don't know if they're working on the balustrades or what, but I'll tell you what you missed. Okay. Could be they were doing all this work on the balustrades. Anyhow, okay. So to be effective, they have to support the militant measures. Because Americans have no choice. Americans are not backing down. They're adhering to their ultimata, the positions they laid out in 1774. I should have said when Congress reassembles, when the Second Congress reassembles at Philadelphia in May 1775, a few weeks after there'd been the outbreak of hostilities in Massachusetts, it gets into what was a real serious debate in which the delegates constantly asked the question, what is our aim? Do we aim for independence? And John Adams says, well, no, we don't want independence from the king, we just want independence from Parliament. There's a very heated debate about war aims. It gets so heated at one point that we know from a single source, nobody ever writes about this in letters back home, but we know from a single source, the diary of Silas Deane, that the delegates, that actually one half of the delegates at one point walk out. So passions were running high and tempers were percolating or festering or simmering or boiling over, whatever tempers are inclined to do. But then the delegates agree. They agree with John Dickinson, who John Adams later denounces as a certain great fortune of piddling genius, that the Americans should send a second petition to the king. The king hasn't answered their first petition. He's kind of sent it to Parliament and sits there, it's tabled, sits on the table, nobody addresses it or answers it. Why send him a second? But Dickinson wants to go the extra mile for reasons he'll discuss in some of the documents you're reading for paper option number 1. So there had been that heavy debate. And it basically ends with the confirmation of the positions taken in 1774. We're not going to back down. We're going to hold to our ultimata. The first concession has to come from the other side. And of course, the corresponding British position is the slippery slope argument. We can't make them any concessions because if we make one, who knows where it's going to end. So we're going to try our experiment, as Burke says, and they'll try theirs, and we'll see which one comes out on top. So the moderates have a dilemma. They have to support those militant measures while they're desperately hoping the British will come to their senses. And the British never do. The last point, though, I think the last 2 points before independence need to be noted. And again, this will be a background for the paper writers, but of general value for the group as a whole. I think 2 things happen, or kind of don't happen, or kind of a combination of do happen and don't happen, that really leave the moderates no choice. One is that word arrives that the British, Americans know the British don't have a large standing army, goes against their political values and so on. They don't have a large standing army. If they're going to put an effective fighting force in North America, they have to go, where do they have to go to get it? Huh? They have to go to Germany. They have to go to Hesse and Brunswick and other principalities, which have a tradition of hiring out soldiers. So they have to recruit. So the first Americans learn that the British have, have signed treaties with various German principalities. Thanks, Nick. With various German principalities in order to get troops. So that seems to be a pretty clear signal that British intentions are to keep prosecuting the war, even though there's been an initial disadvantage. Then secondly, the other thing that happens is the Americans are really desperate. They know there's talk in Britain, the moderates, they know there's talk in Britain that the British might send over a peace commission. And if that commission were to come with the authority and the capacity of negotiating, the moderates are really desperate for this to happen. And what they wind up discovering is that all the Peace Commission can do, the Peace Commission is essentially the Howe brothers, who I have here somewhere. Now here we go. Admiral Lord Richard, on the left, who's going to come over in July 1776 with a massive fleet of reinforcements and ships, and his brother Sir William, also known as Sir Billy. And we'll make a little joke about Sir Billy and his American mistress a little bit down the road. Arise, Sir Billy, and leave your filly is the operative phrase that you want to have in mind here. The Howe brothers are the commanders-in-chief, but they're also peace commissioners. But of what does their peace commission consist? Nothing more nor less than the capacity to take pardons, or to grant pardons to Americans who want to return to their loyalty. There's no authority to negotiate. There's no wiggle room. There's no space for negotiation. And here I think is the last counterfactual point I'll make about the revolution. I think if the British had been able to think outside the box, so to speak, had understood that had really come to grips with the weakness of their position for all the reasons that Burke lays out, they would have authorized the commissioners to be real commissioners, to have real negotiating authority. And had they done so, I think those guys like Morris and Jay, James Wilson, John Dickinson, particularly Thomas Stone, particularly concentrated in the Middle States, or the Middle Colonies about to become the Middle States, I think those guys would have leapt at the chance. Again, because they're not ideologues. They're more inclined to think the British are miscalculating in a serious way, but they're not hell-bent on turning us into slaves. I think the moderates would have jumped on that opportunity. And once they had done so, the radicals would have had no choice but to go along. So there's a real kind of failure of imagination on the part of British policymakers. But I think as late as 1776, I won't say you could have stopped the American movement towards independence dead in its tracks, but a real negotiations would definitely have exploited a potentially serious division in the American ranks between the radicals who know which way things are going and therefore have the advantage of being able to predict pretty accurately, and the moderates who are desperately hoping that the British will come to their senses. The other thing to be said about this, I think the moderates, there's a kind of, I'll say more about this next week, there's a way in which the moderates really come to resent the British for not perceiving their own good intentions. Do you understand what I mean by this? That's the moderates say, here we are, we got involved in politics not because we're national liberators, but because we want to find a way out of this, what looks to be a very costly and destructive mess, precisely because they are men of property. They're people who worry a lot about their estates, and they're not focused on political activity the way Samuel Adams is. Excuse me, and they're not only lawyers. So they have a different set of commitments. And I think they really resent the fact that the British don't appreciate that. The British lump everybody together the way you're often inclined to do in a situation like this. British don't perceive that there are potential divisions among the Americans that they could exploit by a more adroit policy. Okay? So that's how we get to independence. That's why I'm wearing my signer's tie here with Thomas Jefferson. A little gift from my friends at Monticello, where I like to hang out occasionally. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes here. Let's shift gears radically and try to do something that's going to help all you wimps who have chosen paper option number 2. I'm just kidding. They're both actually. That's an assignment I usually give in my upper level course. I thought the first assignment was the easier one, but maybe what do I know? About what your preferences and calculations are. Anybody recognize this young woman? At least young on the left and rather older on the right. This is Hannah Arendt. The great German Jewish political philosopher. Part of the great refugee generation, which had such a transforming impact on American intellectual life by the 1940s and 1950s. Turn today's outline over. When I come to the subject of revolutionary constitutionalism, which is what I now want to introduce, the way in which the circumstances of 1776 slide ineluctably into a political transformation, which we're going to focus on in much greater detail in the next couple of weeks. I'd like to start with this wonderful passage from Arendt's book on revolution. And I'm not going to ask us to read all of it, and I won't waste our time. But let me kind of simply give a quick summary of it, and then I'll steer your attention to a couple of passages that really interest me. So she starts this passage, it's from the opening chapter, by trying to distinguish between what she calls liberation and freedom. And liberation, she says, is something, it defines that liberation essentially is what political philosophers sometimes call negative liberty, meaning an absence of restraint. That's to say, we enjoy negative liberty, which we can enjoy under a variety of regimes, when government doesn't act with us too arbitrarily, where we can exercise our liberty. We can make our life choices. We can move from one place to another. We have civil rights that we can prosecute and pursue, and through a legal system. And she says, liberation is one thing, and freedom, which I think she would define as a kind of positive liberty in a certain sense, freedom is something more. And so let's look at how she does this. She starts by saying that actually the revolutionaries were entitled to their confusion. The point of the matter, the very first paragraph, is that while the former, liberation, the desire to be free from oppression, could have been fulfilled under monarchical rulership, the latter, freedom, necessitated the formation of a new, or rather rediscovered, form of government. It demanded the Constitution. Constitution here means not a document, but a creative act of constituting something. It demanded the constitution of a republic. Nothing, indeed, is truer or more clearly borne out by facts which, alas, have been almost totally neglected by the historians of revolution. She's writing in the early 1960s. That the contests of that day were contests of principle between the advocates of republican and those of kingly government. This will sound a little bit like Gordon Wood's book, right? So that you should think about that when we come back to Wood, I guess, next week, right? Or maybe 2 weeks. And then let's look at this next middle paragraph. But this difficulty in drawing the line between liberation and freedom in any set of historical circumstances does not mean that liberation and freedom are the same, or that those liberties which are won as the result of liberation tell the whole story of freedom. Even though those who tried their hand at both liberation and the foundation of freedom more often than not did not distinguish between these matters very clearly either. In other words, the confusion between liberation and freedom, historically, not philosophically, historically can be natural. Where does one end and the other begin? And then we have this wonderful passage. The men of the 18th century revolutions had a perfect right to this lack of clarity. And this is thinking historically, right? People don't see everything clearly all at once in one Pallas Athena-like fell swoop kind of moment. So they're entitled to this lack of clarity. It was in the very nature of their enterprise that they discovered their own capacity and desire for the charms of liberty, as John Jay, we saw Jay previously, as John Jay once called them, only in the very act of liberation. And here's what I really think is the true insight. And it covers people like the Morrises and Jay, as well as it covers people like the Adamses, more naturally. For the acts and deeds which liberation demanded from them threw them into public business, where intentionally or more often unexpectedly, they began to constitute that space of appearances where freedom can unfold its charms and become a visible, tangible reality. Since they were not in the least prepared for these charms, they could hardly be expected to be fully aware of the new phenomenon. It was nothing less than the weight of the entire Christian tradition, which prevented them from owning up to the rather obvious fact that they were enjoying what they were doing far beyond the call of duty. Whatever the merits of the opening claim of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, it certainly could not appeal by virtue of its charms. Well, unless you're some kind of libertarian, thinks that taxation is the one issue that anybody ever really cares about. It could not appeal by virtue of its charms. It was altogether different with the speech-making and the decision-taking, the oratory and the business, the thinking and the persuading, and the actual doing which proved necessary to drive this claim to its logical conclusion, independent government and the foundation of a new body politic. It was through these experiences that those who, in the words of John Adams, had been called without expectation and compelled without previous inclination, discovered that it is action, not rest, doing, not contemplation, that constitutes our pleasure. It's a wonderful passage, and I think it carries a really powerful insight into what the experience of revolution was like. Now, for further confirmation, let's flip the outline back over and look at these two passages I quote from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who at this time were becoming good friends and only later would be alienated from each other in the 1790s, which I think captures so well what it was like in that spring of independence, when one realized that in addition to standing up for one's rights as conventionally defined, the goal of resistance was no longer the restoration of the status quo ante, the situation of 1763. It really was the creation of a new body politic through the adoption of new government. So look at these two wonderful passages. The first, some of you have read already because it's the concluding paragraph from Adams' Thoughts on Government, which is like Paine's Common Sense, as one of the two critical pamphlets of the early months of 1776. Adams says, "You and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government more than of air, soil, or climate. That sounds like Aaron's comment about physical mobility, right? From the passage I was just looking at. When before the present epocha, this is a word Adams really liked, when before the present epocha had 3 millions of people full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. And then Jefferson, a month after Adams writes this, the Continental Congress adopts a resolution that applies to all those colonies where new governments have not yet been instituted. It's aimed particularly at Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, because those are the proprietary colonies where they don't have royal governors. They have governors appointed by the Penn and Calvert families. But it has a general impact as well, and it adds a kind of fiery preamble to this that John Adams had adopted. And then Thomas Jefferson comes back to Congress a day or so after the resolution is adopted. He writes a letter back to a friend of his in Virginia where he says, look, maybe it'd be a good idea if, it's kind of crazy and really nutty on Jefferson's part. Maybe Congress should adjourn so all of us here in Philadelphia can go back to our respective states and join in the enterprise of constitution making. Which is nuts, because if they did that, then who's going to be running the war? What's going to happen to your national government? Everybody takes a holiday just when things are getting for this. But it shows how much Jefferson cares about this issue. So he says it is a work. That's it being constitution making. It is a work of the most interesting nature, and such as every individual would wish to have his voice in. And then I put this in emphasis. In truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy. For should a bad government be instituted for us in future, it had been as well to have accepted at first the bad one offered to us from beyond the water without the risk and expense of contest. I think this marks Adams' statement, Adams' exultation at the end of his pamphlet, Jefferson's statement in this private letter, wishing, here's poor Jefferson, he's going to be eternally famous for writing the Declaration of Independence, the assignment he's about to get in a few weeks, 3 weeks down the road. Instead, he really wants to be back in Williamsburg. If Jefferson had his druthers, he would have been back in Virginia and not be stuck in Philadelphia writing the Declaration. He doesn't quite get it in terms of his long-term historical reputation, but what he does get is this remarkable transformation in what is the whole purpose, what is the whole objective of this whole enterprise. The whole object of the present controversy. Nobody would have said that in 1775. The whole object of the present controversy down through that year was to a restoration of prior rights, not national independence. But now things have gone too far, and we're not going back. So constitution making becomes the great enterprise that gets underway in the spring of 1776, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about its implications over the next couple of weeks, culminating, of course, in the Federal Constitution of 1787. I introduced this theme a little bit on Monday in my executive power lecture, and so I'll, let me make a couple of points quickly that'll just restate a couple of things I said then, and then I'll try to end this lecture by helping to set up those of you who are working on the second paper option. So what are some key things to keep in mind about constitution making? The first thing is it shows, I think, the depth of Americans' commitment to legal government. If you're making a revolution, it may not be the best thing to get distracted by the enterprise of constitution making. There may be real advantages in terms of how you conduct the struggle, to maintaining the so-called extra-legal forms, the kinds of committees and conventions, congresses. There may be advantages not having to conform to law in every respect, because you have to keep the people unified, and those who aren't going to support you have to find some way to kind of keep them in their place or crack down on them or whatever. Maybe that in terms of efficiency, you want to be bound by the normal requirements of full legality. But the fact is, Anglo-American culture is a deeply legalized culture. Think again about that passage in Burke's speech when he talks about they're all smatterers at the law. They all think they're lawyers, and not just those going to college trying to wonder what happens after a financial collapse. Do I go to law school or not, Catherine?
I was just wondering when I was reading that. Is that true that Americans were really that more versed in legal matters?
Is it really true? It's hard to measure it because
I was under the impression a lot of Americans were poor and just trying to scrape by.
No, I don't think they're poor and just trying to scrape by, but there's a deep sense of property and the rights of property. I do think you make a good argument. Remember what I said earlier about the way in which colonial governance is highly decentralized, right? That, it's not from the top down. It's really, committees of selectmen and juries. Juries are a critical institution of governance. It's not just about somebody being convicted of a crime or even how you resolve civil disputes. Juries are a powerful civil institution, and they require the effective participation of the adult citizenry. So I think you can assume there is a high level of legal knowledge in the American population. Generally, some of it's knowledge of this is how we do it around here, as opposed to reading Blackstone. But remember, as Burke notes, Blackstone was selling better in America than he was in England. So this is a deeply legal culture, and people want to restore legal government. So that's point number one. Point number two, I'll just make this en passant, in passing, because we have to come back and explain in much fuller detail. To say some people in 1776 do understand when we're writing constitutions, they start thinking, well, what do we mean when we talk about a constitution? What is a constitution? The previous term, the previous usage, think about that John Adams passage where he has to do the two metaphors. You know, a constitution's like a machine or it's like an organism. Americans do start thinking now that a constitution actually is a document. Why? It's kind of the great accident or the great inadvertent circumstance of 1776. That if you're going to replace the old governments, okay, you know, so you want to restore legal government. You can't restore the old governments because they, with the exceptions of Connecticut and Rhode Island, the two oddball corporate colonies. Every place else you have, you know, either a proprietary governor or a royal governor. So legal government in America has been paralyzed. This is the point I made on Monday. Legal government in America basically collapses in 1774. And it does so primarily because government requires the active participation of the executive. The executive represents the crown. The crown is not going to participate in any kinds of seditious activities that are going to be defiant of imperial authority. So that's why this whole apparatus of committees and conventions has emerged. That's why, but you can't simply restore the old government. If you want to restore legality, you can't restore the old government because a big part of it drew its authority from the crown. You have to replace it. In a sense, you have to be creative. And to agree what you're going to do, you got to write it down. So the written Constitution is, in that sense, it's a circumstantial accident. It's not that Americans are saying we need to have a new definition of constitutionalism itself because the old one didn't work for us. Right? It's not that we looked at this, you know, this tradition where you can have these two rival positions and you can't resolve a fundamental conflict of the kind the British and Americans were experiencing. It's not as if they wake up in 75 and 1776 and say, that was a bad model of constitutionalism we had, and now we need a new one. You know, a written document operating supreme fundamental law. Although, again, there are glimmers of this when we read, I don't think we're reading this week, but when we read the fourth letter on interesting subjects. As part of, I'm pretty sure it's in my reader. I think I'm right about this. Maybe I'm wrong. I have to go back. Anyhow, but there, you can see some expressions of the idea that, you know, the British have had this rotten, this defective definition of the Constitution. We can come up with a better one. But in 1776, the idea, what will become the mature American idea, that a written Constitution is a document adopted at a specific moment of historic time under specific, distinctive, extraordinary rules and procedures which allow you to distinguish a Constitution as supreme, fundamental, higher law from all other forms of legal action. That definition is not yet available, though there are glimmers of it here and there. It's not something that's yet been fully realized. It's going to emerge from the process of constitution making rather than being an a priori, ex ante guide to what constitution making ought to be like. You guys with me on this? That's a kind of deep theoretical point. We're going to come back and talk about this. Let me just close by setting up the problem. So if we look at these new constitutions as they're being written from late 75, well, really 1776 on, I said on Monday that one distinctive feature is what I call the Zorro principle. You know, the effective evisceration of executive power. Taking the prerogative out of executive power, turning the executive into a mere agency of the legislative will. But the second and more distinctive feature is the idea, and we find this most clearly expressed in John Adams' thoughts on government, so pay attention here. The second and more important idea is that the essence of a Republican government, of a Republican Constitution, is going to revolve around the principle of the practice of representation. And Adams' distinctive move, you said, what did I think the most striking move that Adams makes, what I think is a great innovation when he makes it, because I don't know of any antecedents for it, but then becomes something of a commonplace once he's done it. The great American move, the great innovative move here is to say a representative assembly, when you look at a representative assembly, meaning first and foremost, the lower house, the popularly elected branch, the one most accountable to the people. When you look at that representative assembly, you should see something that's going to be either a miniature or a mirror. Sometimes you see the phrase used, a portrait or a transcript of the larger society. You should be able to look at a representative assembly. If I were to say you guys were an assembly and you're representative of the Stanford student body, and in fact I don't think you are, because I can think of some significant, just look at your faces, I can see some significant variances from the overall pool. But even so, I would say I should be able to look at you, and when I look at you, I should see that larger society that you are representing and representing in this one room. Now, why is this a radical move? Because in England, the dominant idea was that the House of Commons embodied the whole people. But not in the sense, not as a mapping function, not in terms of proportionality, not in terms of a direct correspondence, but just really as a collective entity, a kind of undifferentiated people. And remember, the British don't care whether or not constituencies are represented in proportion to their population. If lots of constituencies are not, well, c'est la vie, as the French would say. That's life. Too bad. So long as those representatives have adequate information about what the whole society needs, that's all you need to do. Adams carries that principle further than the British did. We'll come back and talk about the significance of this as we go on. It's tied to the principle of annual elections. But it leaves open, one basic puzzle leaves open for the paper writers. If the lower house is representative of the whole people in some fairly direct correspondence, mirror, miniature, portrait, transcript, mapping function, if I'm using that term correctly, for the Math 51 veterans or whatever. If the lower house is so directly representative of the people, as Adams and others agree it should be, and if it is a republic where all authority stems from the people, and where the people is thought of as, in a sense, well, as a collective mass, sharing a number of common traits, not undifferentiated, but as a collective mass, why have an upper house at all? An upper house historically had been thought of in kind of classic political theory and the so-called model of mixed government, which I think I spoke about previously. The upper house wasn't representing anything. It wasn't representing the aristocracy. It was the aristocracy. But you're not going to have an aristocracy of any kind of conventional kind in a Republican government, right? Where you have a community of virtuous citizens. So the whole question of why do you have an upper house is a bit of a puzzle, theoretically. It's a problem. It's not clear what it's going to represent. If the people are perfectly represented in the lower house, why do you need an upper house at all? It might be redundant, it might be superfluous. It's hard to say what's it supposed to represent. So when you read those three pamphlets, the things that, Adams' Thoughts on Government, Braxton's address to the Assembly of the Ancient and Honorable, whatever it is, the Honorable Assembly of the Ancient Dominion of Virginia, the prolific Mr. Anonymous's, the People, the Best Governors. What you have to, I want you to try to look at two things. What is the general theory of representation that each of these authors is espousing? And once you've nailed that, because I think you really have to understand that, then ask the question, what positions are they taking about the character of an upper house, its function, and the kind of power it should have? Having this notion of the sufficiency, the mirror, the miniature is the kind of starting principle, ought to help you to contextualize and define what you have to look at to analyze that problem successfully. So my time is up. Sorry about the noise we had at the beginning of the hour, and we'll come back next week.
The Human Experience. Inside the Humanities at Stanford University. humanexperience.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.